I wrote a book on rapid climate change. I'll tell you why I wrote it, but I'll also tell you a little bit about my background. I was trained as I started out in sciences and pre-med like a lot of students and sort of got uninterested and then focused on the social sciences. I founded the Institute and was the executive director of the Institute for Sustainability at Chico State. And right now, the tsunami interests me, and I'll come back to some references related to that, because I'm working with a biophysicist on the concept of resilience. We're writing a book on the conditions under which ecosystems, social systems, political systems, and economic systems are and are not resilient. And that actually grew out of my interest in climate change. So I'm going to talk for about a half an hour, and then I want to get into a discussion about, and what do you do about the fact that there are a great number of people who don't believe the science. But I want to talk a little bit about the science. So the way in which this book, which is written for undergraduate students in universities, is laid out is first I talk about the science, what we know for sure, and then I talk about, and if we really know these things for sure, how come people don't believe them? And then third is why, as human beings, we're kind of hardwired not to see and understand risk. We really do have blind spots, evolutionary blind spots. Our ability to focus on the future is, quite frankly, limited. And then finally, because I didn't want to end the book on a note of total pessimism, it's sort of, well, what would you do if you were an individual and you were trying to make a contribution? And though everybody wants to make a contribution, this is way beyond recycling cans and bottles. I wrote about this because I was really aggravated. And the reason I got aggravated is I have a friend, a fairly wealthy person who spends his time hanging out in one of the bars in town, and he knew that I was interested in climate change. So we would meet, and he'd say, well, the reason that the Earth is heating up is it's a naturally occurring event. I'd say, well, what do you mean? Well, I heard on radio that it's sunspots. And so I try to patiently explain, yeah, sunspots are real, and they go in a cycle of 11,000 years, and we're now coming out of the period in which it should have been heating up, and it should be cooling down right now. And in fact, they have virtually no effect whatsoever on the temperature on Earth, and certainly not on the buildup of CO2 in the atmosphere. And then he'd say, well, this is just a cycle that we go through. And I'd say, yeah, the Earth wobbles like a top, tilts, and it changes its orbit ever so slightly around the Earth. And it does these things on a 41,000-year cycle, a 100,000-year cycle, and a 21,000-year cycle. And then I would be told, well, it's cold in Florida. And I went there on my vacation. How can the Earth be warming? Or take the recent storms in the Northeast, for which there are really good explanations. It can't be this rainy, and it can't be this cold, and it cannot be snowing if the Earth is warming. So I would try to move the conversation to the science that has been done to try to explain that it is really anthropocentric. That is, we are the problem, and we, as Americans, are especially to blame because as 5% of the world's population, we contribute about 20% of the buildup of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere every year. And that gets kind of an interesting idea. When I say to somebody, your contribution is 20 tons, you're emitting 72 more tons of CO2 and 72 times more CO2 into the atmosphere than a Kenyan. And it's how can that be? How can air even weigh anything? And then you try to explain, well, when you burn a gallon of gas, it actually doubles in weight. Well, how can that be? Have you ever carried a 5-gallon bucket of water, which is made up of hydrogen and oxygen? So part of what I think needs to be done, or I was trying to do just as a normal person, was trying to come up with a story and metaphors and images that would make sense to somebody who was not a scientist and who was not going to pay attention to the science. Now, another thing that I think is really important to do in talking about the science of climate change is not to make claims that can't be substantiated. So, for example, the buildup of CO2 in the atmosphere obviously traps more heat, which then melts the ice, which then theoretically, by the year 2100, could raise sea levels by a meter, which would cause flooding in Bangladesh, wipe out most low-lying deltas and agricultural areas around the world. But we don't know exactly how that is going to play out. And for those of you who've studied systems theory, you know how many variables you've got that you're trying to explain at any given time. You're trying to explain, well, how fast is the ocean warming? What happens when it becomes more acidic? Do we have any examples from the past, and can we use those to generalize to the future? Most people who write about science, the science of climate change, quite frankly, are frantic. They're frantic because they can't get people to pay attention to them or understand, and because they know that there is a catastrophe out there waiting to happen. So, for example, the young man who brought up the example of the tsunami, where the Pacific plate pushes against so hard that it's bent and then it literally flips up. 9.0. Everybody knew there was going to be a quake. Everybody knew there was going to be a tsunami. We know there are going to be aftershocks, but we don't know their magnitude and we don't know that they will occur. The only thing that we can predict with absolute certitude is there will be a catastrophe. We know, even though there are 444 nuclear plants in the world, not counting those that are in submarines, and though those have run well for decades, we know that there will be a catastrophe that happens. We just can't predict when, but we can prepare for catastrophe. So when we talk about climate change, we try to think about both mitigation and adaptation, because there's a lot of warming already in the pipeline. So, for example, my grandfather had a Buick. What difference does that make? When he stuck his key in the ignition and turned it on, he was participating in a really interesting experiment. The CO2 from his exhaust pipe is still up there in the atmosphere. It's a slow buildup. We know that the Earth is going to continue to warm, even if we manage to lower our emissions to 1950 levels by tomorrow. We've already got 2 degrees Fahrenheit in the pipeline. That's just going to happen. So we have to think about, well, how do you adapt? How do you adapt cultures? How do you adapt economies? We know that the ecosystem will adapt. Well, why? Well, the Earth is about 4.5 billion years old. It's made up of basic elements which don't change. Whatever happens, a meteorite hits the Earth will survive. We might not, but we know that the Earth will continue to evolve and will achieve an equilibrium. That we know. But the Earth has before, at times we know about, tipped out of equilibria. For example, one of the things that science fiction writers love to talk about is the thermohaline circulation. And why is that a big deal? Well, because this is the warm water that comes out of the South Pacific, wanders all the way up around India, up, down, and around the coast of Africa, finally reaching the North Atlantic, plunging down with billions of gallons, and that takes, by the way, 1 molecule of water takes 1,000 years to circulate. But it stopped before. It stopped when a giant ice dam, natural giant ice dam, broke in Canada and flooded the North Atlantic with fresh water. Thermohaline, heat and salt, changed the salinity, changed the temperature, and you stop that current. Well, why does that matter? Well, because it plunged the Earth into an ice age. Now, an ice age is not a big deal when you've only got a couple of million people scattered all over the globe and they can get up and move. But we've got 7 billion people on the planet right now, and we're going to go to 9 billion by 2050. No matter what we do, unless there's some unidentified plague that we don't know about. So the Earth could, and has before, tip. These tipping points are really important. As the Earth warms, we're finding that the monsoon season is shifting ever so slightly in India. Why does that matter? Because most of Indian agriculture is dependent on groundwater pumping. And those aquifers in western India are beginning to run dry. Those are wells that have been hand dug by women. And by the way, rapid climate change doesn't affect everybody equally all over the world. You and I might be able to adjust to climate change by going over and turning the thermostat on the wall up or down. But somebody who lives, as Archbishop Desmond Tutu pointed out, climate shocks, you don't adjust to them when you're living on $2 a day. And there are at least 2 billion people in the world, at least 1 billion children, living on less than $2 a day. So climate change has radically differential impacts on people. Its impacts around the globe are going to vary considerably. Some areas will be wetter. And depending on these models that you look at, either we're living in an area that's going to get a lot wetter or a lot drier. Now, I don't mean to mock the models. It's just that we're right on the borderline here. So either Oregon's going to get a whole lot wetter or we're going to be right on the edge of an area that gets wetter, and you would think we were if you took this year as an example. But climate change is not about just 1 year. The Amazonian rainforest depends on Earth that blows all the way out of the Sahel, or what's called the Baudelaire Depression in Chad. All the way from Africa, dust blows. And actually, it has a beneficial effect. It carries nutrients to the Amazon. Well, why should that matter? Because 10,000 years ago, the wind stopped blowing. And nobody knows why. It just stopped. So, without going through all of these tipping points, I only want to note that one of the reasons that you get kind of tough talk from people like Jim Hansen, probably the most preeminent climate scientist in the world, is that they have, the geological record is really pretty clear. The Earth achieved an equilibrium over millions and billions of years, and we have come along, a naked ape, stuck a straw in the ground and found this black stuff that squirted out, and now we have an economy that runs 24/7 on fossil fuel. The fossil fuel problem is huge. We have enough coal in the United States to supply our needs easily, energy needs easily, for at least another century. No problem, right? Coal produces a kilowatt of electricity at about 3 cents a kilowatt hour. Nuclear power produces energy at about 3.5 cents an hour, which is also dirt cheap. Solar, much, much more expensive. Wind, about the same amount as coal and nuclear power. But right now, worldwide, only about 1% of all the power is what we think of as renewable. The rest is oil and coal. China has been bringing online old-style coal-fired plants 1 a month for the last decade. And there are plenty. Now, that's not China's fault. I mean, you've got to solve a huge problem of inequality. So when you're looking at climate change, think of climate change as a wicked problem. It's not just all of a sudden we got to stop using less fossil fuel. It's we have problems of global inequality that are security issues as well as moral issues. In other words, there are people all over the world who want to live like us. North African disruptions are partly about we could be like them. We could vote. We could vote for people who try to gut the EPA. So, I'm going to cut the science here short because I'm sure you'll come back with your own observations and questions and come to the question of, so if all of these things are true, the Earth is getting warmer, it's because of CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere, as well as methane, which I did not mention, which some see as a ticking time bomb. And there are 4,000 square miles of peat melting in Siberia, which in the Earth's history, there was a methane explosion before, which tipped the Earth out of balance. So we got all these problems that are interlocked. Why wouldn't people believe this? Well, one easy answer would be, gee, people didn't pay attention in their science class. A second reason would be people do not want to believe that they are the problem. Partly because if you believe that you're part of the problem, and if you're living in the United States, we are part of the problem, just like Pogo said. We have met the enemy, and he is us. And it is also, for some people, an issue of morality. Science is seen as an ideology. Well, how could you think science was just another idea system? Let me try to explain. One of the things that we have a hard time with is that if you're a newspaper reporter or a television reporter, and talk to people from the New York Times who said, Scott, I can't get a byline, namely a column with their name on it, unless I present the issue as a controversy. So for at least, climate change has been known about since the 1970s, and actually, depending on how far back you want to push this, we've known about buildup of CO2 in the atmosphere for over 100 years. But newspaper writers and journalists and people who write books have often said, and there is a group of scientists who have taken the opposite position. They've said they believe that this is a hoax, and certainly Senator Inhofe from Oklahoma, our environmental senator, has seen it as a great hoax. 30,000 scientists have signed a petition, in fact, that says climate change is a hoax. These 30,000 scientists, and I invite you to go to the site and you too can sign the petition. It's the Oregon Institute of Science and Medicine. Does anybody know where the Oregon Institute of Science and Medicine is? Oregon. Who can not like that answer? Cave Junction, Oregon. It used to be a warehouse facade in Portland where, three old guys, and now they've rounded up another one, stands outside of their office in Cave Junction, Oregon. But people who get aggravated like me have actually gone and looked at who are these 30,000 people that signed the petition. And out of these 30,000 people, I think 1% of them have PhDs. Not all of them have degrees of any kind. Now, it doesn't mean that having a PhD makes you an authority on anything. But it is an indication that there is nobody who's a recognized climate scientist any place in the world that signed these petitions. And the only people who signed them are the people who've been paid by oil companies and coal companies to go around the world and deny that fossil fuels are a problem. For example, California, Proposition 23, the flip side of 32. Who funded 23? Well, you know that. Valero Oil Company out of Texas, the Koch brothers, who have petrochemical interest out of Wichita, Kansas. And this, the opposition to science and scientific explanations for social policy or grounding social policy in scientific explanations started way back in the 1970s, right after all of the programs that Jimmy Carter tried to get started were gutted and disappeared. At that time, conservative think tanks began to fight back and take control of the policy process. One of the things that is perhaps most evident in terms of control of the policy process were the cutting of taxes since Reagan's presidency, except when he was governor of California and raised taxes. But this move to say it's always about jobs, The discussions in the House of Representatives were about jobs. Well, no. It's about, quite frankly, who has the most money to pay for the argument. I mean, this is really a very nasty debate. Imagine that, I mean, I loved Michael Crichton's Fear Factor. I thought that was a wonderful book as a piece of science fiction. It was larded with footnotes seeking to demonstrate that climate change science was a hoax. Senator Inhofe tried to make it required reading for all members of his committee. President Bush invited Michael Crichton to the White House. The American petroleum engineers gave him an award for his science. If you've never read Fear Factor, you ought to, because it's where people get some of their ideas. When I was on KCHO about a month ago, I was talking about climate science, and I heard somebody in the called in and said, "Do you not know that CO2 is good for us?" Well, yeah, of course. We wouldn't have life without photosynthesis. CO2 is really important. But how much do you need? But every point she made came directly out of a book called Climategate.
Climategate.
And when Al Gore, and here's part of the problem, and I just want you guys to think about this. Al Gore did his great book and his great presentation. It was a PowerPoint presentation. And he didn't even have hand gestures. But no, it was a great presentation, and so was the book. And one of the things he said was most telling. It is an inconvenient truth, and we must change our behavior. Now, that, to me, that's kind of innocuous. Yeah, right, we need to do things a little differently. But for many people it was, what do you mean change our behavior? For them, that's, in a way, a political attack. It's why in this country we now have a 50 percentage point gap between self-identified Democrats and Republicans in terms of, is climate change real and is it caused by humans? 50 percentage points. Uganda, public opinion poll, they know we're to blame. But they all believe, or at least those ones who answered the poll, that yeah, climate change is real and we, Ugandans, are going to have to figure out how to adapt. We're going to have to figure out how to farm differently. We're going to have to figure out our water problem. But we made it into a political issue because it's a way of life issue. And as a social scientist, one of the things that really fascinates me is if I were to ask a group of people to answer the question, do you believe that resources should be shared more equally around the world? The answer to that question correlates really highly with whether or not you believe climate change is real and humans have caused it. Egalitarians will accept the notion of climate change, will accept responsibility. People who are defined as more individualistic do not. So, in trying to think about this issue, we need to be able to tell stories about things that matter to us, because stories are what connect the past, the present, and the future. So a story that says you're doomed, and you did it, and we're not going to be able to get out of this unless you go back to living in a cave. That's not a great narrative. We need to move into discussions about, as human beings, what are we really like? Now, there is an enormous amount of controversy among evolutionary biologists about what we're really like. One recent book that just came out on the mathematics of altruism gives mathematics for 5 different kinds of altruism. Another book that's coming out this month argues that, in fact, because we've evolved to be altruistic in groups, we're selfish because we hog everything for our group and we don't take other people into account. Another book, on the other hand, argues that the way forward to the future is that, you know what Durham's number is? Okay, it's about the prefrontal cortex. It's actually it's the logic on which Facebook is based. We can only deal with a limited number of people. That is, we're hardwired to deal with, nobody is sure exactly what the number is, somewhere between 50 and 150 people. And if you look at Anasazi villages, if you look at platoons, if you look at all kinds of organizations, we're clustered into these groups. And all Facebook does is just aggregate groups of about 50. But if you believe that we're aggregated into these groups, then you can argue that we can extend our concept of family because it's hardwired into us or not. And I don't know exactly where I am on this issue. I'm sort of trying to write my way through it right now, but the scientific thicket is quite dense. Look, I'm a professor. I'm hardwired to talk for between 50 minutes, if that's the class period, or 2 hours and 50 minutes, which is what my normal class period is. But I'm going to stop because I've talked a little bit about the science. I've talked a little bit about deniers. I've talked a little bit about some of the issues that relate to, and why wouldn't you believe that? And then maybe we can have a discussion about, well, how would you get people to believe you? And how do you get people to act? Sure.
What it's always puzzled me is when I've read the research that it's like tree rings when they go through certain places of ice in Antarctica, and they can actually see the ice ages through the molecular structure of the water that's deposited. And that seems like pretty hard evidence, right?
Right. So could I add to that a little bit? Mm-hmm. So there's a couple of things there. One is, by drilling the ice cores, you can figure out what was the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere over thousands of years. And the benchmark that is taken is 1865. In 1865, the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was 288 parts per million. It's now about 370 parts per million, and it goes up about 2 percentage points each year. A lot of people believe that 350 parts per million was a tipping point. That is, once you get past 350, we're going to have problems of mitigation and adaptation. So why isn't that information shared? Well, I don't know how it's not shared. In other words, the data is available to virtually anyone that wants it. But if I go online, for example, when I was in class last week, I wanted, optimumpopulation.org. I wanted to show my students, while I was talking, there's a clock that just ticks right behind you showing the number of people added to the Earth. But first I went to optimum population and it took me to Glenn Beck. And no, that's not where I want to go. So the way most people, you and I, get up in the morning, read our newspaper. If we got a computer, we want to know something, we go online. But unless you're really persistent and you know where you want to go, there are a lot of blind alleys out there available for you. And if you were to Google anything on climate change, you're probably going to end up in, sooner or later, one of the sites that are sponsored and paid for by conservative think tanks. If you Google Al Gore, one of the first sites that pops up is one that says, Al Gore wants to be God and kill little children. Well, the extension of this logic is that he's trying to prevent development in the third world and therefore going to cause babies to starve because you won't be building an economy in the third world, which is a bit of a stretch. You started out with a point that I want to kind of reinforce. That, and it's Frida Capra is the one who's talked about the concept of a wicked problem, where the wicked problems are coupled problems of, even if we didn't have climate change, we're pumping down fossil aquifers all over the world. In Saudi Arabia's given up on ag in their own country and is buying up land in Africa in order to deal with the fact they don't have any water. You've got, too many people on the planet. I mean, you just have too many people on the planet competing for finite resources, which are only going to get more scarce. Then you have, the fact that the globe is warming, and then you have global inequality. And that's only 4. So trying to figure out and there are people who are writing about this who really don't know what the answer is. What's the exit strategy? So most of the world's oil is not owned by oil companies, it's owned by national governments, and we're not one of them. I mean, we sit on something like, I think 3% of the world's oil supply. I mean, I may have that wrong, but it's not much. 30% of our domestic supply comes out of the Gulf of Mexico. On my way down, I had to didn't have to listen to NPR, but I was listening to why we should gut the EPA, because it will raise the price of gasoline. Well, yeah, the price of gasoline is going to go up. Well, we should drill in Anwar. Well, even the oil companies' best estimates is that there are about 16 billion barrels of oil in Anwar. You know how many billion barrels a year we use? About 7. And not all of that oil is recoverable. So maybe you get a year's worth of oil out of sucking dry and destroying the environment in an area that is extremely important to wildlife. So trying to figure out what these strategies are and trying to figure out an exit strategy is not simple. There are 2 basic economic theories that look at, and what do you do? Stern, the British Sir David Stern, is that his name? Whatever Stern's name is, the Stern Report. He was in the Blair government, and they came out with a report that argued that we needed to invest between 1% and 2% of the gross national product of the world, or about $2 trillion a year, into alternative energies in order to develop an exit strategy. The other economist on the other side, and this is an argument, technical argument about discount rate. If I believe that people in the future are going to be richer than I am and more technologically sophisticated, they should solve the problem. Now, if I mean, that's a standard economic argument. It's based on the discount rate. Do you believe other people are going to be better off in the future, or that we need to focus on the future? So, good point.
So I missed part of that discussion, but it seems to me that there's no scenario you can wrap around this that doesn't result in a reduced standard of living for us.
Well, that's an
no standard of living.
I don't know. You know, I wonder if it really is a reduced standard of living or just a different standard of living. Because, like, I did buy a condo that was marked, because it was marketed as green, that's why I got it. And my utility bills are like almost nothing. And I feel my standard of living has gone way up, you know, because it's so efficient.
So one of the questions I ask my students, I mean, it's a writing assignment. What's civilization? And I'm not asking them to do a regression analysis. It's, what do you think constitutes decent quality of life? And do and so call up your grandparents if they're still around. And what they find out is Grandma and Grandpa had a garden in the backyard. They went to town maybe once a week. What people think of when we ask people, what do you value? What do you really care about? They say community, friends. And if you start there, you end up with a discussion about, well, what do we need to create that's within walking distance? So there are communities trying to, you know, people are building communities where, you know, work, worship, school, everything is within, you know, is accessible. So, yeah, maybe the standard of living will be different, but it's sort of getting people to think about, well, how much stuff do you need before you go mad? I mean, what do we really need? What do we care about? I mean, you're here because you care about one another and you talk to one another about the same ideas.
Yeah, but, you know, part of it, maybe I chose the wrong words by saying standard of living.
I may not have answered your question either.
No, you didn't. I was sort of putting another angle on it. There's the quality of life, that's one thing. Standard of living, another thing. And when we think about standard of living, really is based on our capitalist consumer society. And what my point was, I don't see any scenarios where our economy doesn't continue to get even worse than it is right now. And there's no, in our political system, part of the reason I would argue that we are where we are now in our current economic decline is that for years, recessions were stalled by pumping the economy with lower interest rates, and that drove up the housing costs, and, you know, but the point is, we have this short-term immediate return both in our economy and in our government. Elected officials have to maintain the economy to get reelected. People in corporations have to show immediate profit, and it's all short-term, both our political system and our economic. So how do we address that? And is there any scenario where we can make that shift, other than drastic changes both in our economy and our government?
It sort of depends, my answer, on what side of the bed I get up on in the morning. Sometimes I'm really discouraged, and other times I think, well, this may be doable. But when I talk to, you know, the people I talk to, it's, dude, this isn't working. This is going to fall apart. Now, there's this huge literature out there about, and maybe capitalism is just a 50-year bubble. Maybe it is. And, you know, that's quite possible. Because the rate of return on capital depends on basically accumulation. Accumulation that comes out of human labor. And in a perfect economic system, it would ultimately tend to equilibrium all over the world. And so capital has chased cheap labor, but even the Chinese are trying to chase cheap labor, going to South America, going to other Asian countries. The model doesn't work anymore. It's simply a development model that doesn't work. Now, your question to me is, and what would? Nobody's got an answer. They have part of an answer. So part of the answer starts with, what do you do about the bottom billion? Do you transfer technologies? And there are economists who work on what they call BOP, bottom of the pyramid. How do you develop appropriate technologies that can be made by people in their country that are based on, that are sustainably based? They don't have the answer to this. So it's always these little things that people are doing. But putting CFLs in and switching out incandescent bulbs, it's way beyond that. But yeah, we have short-term political systems, short-term economic systems, and our big corporations are schizophrenic. So corporate leaders are told, develop models of sustainability. And when they do, their board of directors say, well, the rate of return dropped and we're only getting 10% this year and we got 15% the year before, get it back up. So I mean, the economic, I'm not arguing for a socialist model. I'm just noting we don't have any models right now that anybody can figure out except these kinds of things where people say, like, it is going to collapse, so what you have to do is develop redundant systems. And redundant systems are, where are you going to get your food? Where are you going to get your water? How are you going to heat yourself? How are you going to take care of your family? And one group called the Transition Initiative is kind of the 60s equivalent of tune in, turn on, drop out. Can't even remember. And it wasn't because of the drugs, believe me. So lots of people all over the world are trying to figure out, what do you do? But I don't think there are any good answers. I wish there were. I could be famous.
And that makes it hard to make a social movement, you know, to address these problems.
Yes, it does. But one of the problems I think that you're trying to start with is, why can't we make social policy decisions based on science?
Because it's short term, and we elect our officials, and if they don't produce an expanded economy, they're thrown out. So how can they address big issues?
Well, I would note that why is it that science came to be seen as an ideology? How did that happen?
When it started to affect the bottom line.
Well, I would say it started in the universities in the 1980s, when people began to talk about, hey, my ideology is just as good as your ideology. Any ideology is a form of trying to repress other people. Now, and there's a really famous, it was incredibly important, a book by Thomas Kuhn called The Scientific Revolution, which was, I think, misunderstood by everyone in the humanities and misunderstood by a lot of other people. He wasn't saying that science is just a matter of brute struggle. He was saying that, you know, you go along with accepted models until enough evidence builds up, and then all of a sudden somebody has an aha moment, and it's, oh man, why didn't I think of that? And then you're looking at the world in a different way, but not really. I mean, evolutionary biology has built on thousands and thousands and thousands of studies. We're just now starting to put together the math with the molecular biology and developing better understandings. But it's not all of a sudden a totally new idea system. But this notion was appropriated most specifically in the humanities to argue that why bother to study science? It's just about oppression. And trust me, I've read through this literature, and I'm one of the people who've written about it. It's just crazy. Here's NASA. Here's James Hansen. Here's President Obama's science advisor. Here's all of the people at East Anglia. Here's the Aussies. Here's people at Penn State, University of Michigan, all over the world saying exactly the same thing. And people say, la, la, la. So I don't think it's about the science, because the science is really pretty clear. Well, I take that back. It's clear about we're doing it, who's causing the buildup of CO2 in the atmosphere, what the consequences are going to be. It's that I think maybe people don't understand that within the scientific community, it's, okay, if the ice melts, then won't the land on which this is a recent paper by a physicist, won't the land actually rise? Because it's now being pushed down by the ice. Well, yeah, nobody thought of that, but it'll probably be like 1/4 of an inch. But somebody grabs that and says, well, the scientists can't agree. So there's manufactured dissent. And it's sort of it's needing to push back against that manufactured dissent. But it's not just you or the people that you're trying to help. I went in to give a lecture in a course called Science and Human Values, taught by a scientist at Chico State, because they wanted me to talk about why don't people believe the science. So I asked them later, about a week later, I said, well, how'd that go? Well, the students didn't believe you. I said, well, what do you mean? Well, they think that climate science is a hoax. Well, what are you doing in the classroom that a class on science and human values, that 27 out of 30 students thinks that it ain't happening? Well, why do they think that? Because it would be inconvenient for them to do so. It's an inconvenient truth. And that's the issue with which I think we're struggling, and we don't have a good answer. So for example, some people would take Copenhagen as an example of what won't work. That the expectation that you're going to get nations from around the world to agree on limiting their CO2 reductions. Most countries went there expecting China and the United States to do something. China probably appropriately said, we will do it as a percentage of our growth, not a flat rate. The underdeveloped countries said, we didn't cause this problem, you did, you need to solve it. And furthermore, fork over $450 billion a year in order to help us transition to a clean economy. That didn't happen. So one thought that has come out of this, and it's kind of a bizarre one for many people, is that the world's economy are really controlled by 50 major corporations. In other words, there are 50 corporations whose equivalent GDP is greater than most of the nations of the world. Just is. That's the way it is. And in virtually all of those large corporations, they've come to the conclusion that their current business models are unsustainable. That is, they know they're using up resources that can't be replaced. They know they've got to find different energy sources. They know they've got to find different packaging. They know they've got to do cradle to cradle. So they know this. And most of the movement that you see worldwide is occurring among corporations, not governments. So that's one argument. The other argument is that do it in your community. Do it in your state. So California is probably more progressive in terms of its climate legislation than any other state in the United States. So use that as a model, because you're not going to be able to get the United States, given its senatorial system, with a handful of senators from fossil-rich states like Wyoming and Kentucky agreeing to reduce greenhouse gases. You're going to have to get it done state by state by state, community by community by community. So that's another strategy. What would you do?
Don't have the answer.
Neither do I. I mean, I wished I did. If I had a really good answer, I'd give it to you, but I've been working on this issue, this general issue of sustainability, oh man, for a long time, or issues related to the environment. I mean, I've been angry since I was a kid. And the reasons were kind of simple. You know, everybody's got a kind of arrow through the heart moment. When we moved to Oregon, we were in a grade school that did good things. When there was a forest fire, you went out and you planted trees. It was, you know, a great day. You got to go out to the woods. You didn't have to stay in the classroom. You got all sooty, and you planted a bunch of trees with the girls, or the girls with the boys. And so I'd watch my trees grow on the way to the Oregon coast. And every year we'd grow, the trees bigger and bigger. And one year we went, and all the trees were gone. And I said, Dad, what happened to my trees? Well, they weren't your trees, son. They belonged to the Forest Service. Well, what did the Forest Service do with the trees? Well, they sold them to the timber company. Cut them right down to the road. And then when I was in graduate school, we had this beautiful fishing hole. You could always count on getting rainbow out of it, always. And so, with my friends, springtime, you're in graduate school, get your fly rods, go. We couldn't find the stream. We couldn't, the hole was gone, the stream was gone, because of clear-cut logging that had bulldozed and pushed everything into the stream. The stream was gone. So, you know, it's trying to take those kind of moments and figure out, all right, people need to make a living logging. Trees are a renewable resource, but folks, there's got to be a better way to do this. So I think we all have these moments. We need to try to figure out how to put them together. I think locally is the best way to do so. I'm done.